You don't have to be an Old Testament prophet to predict that the proverbial is going to hit the rotating swirly thing big time here in April. Unless the current trajectory we're speeding along, like an arrow heading for the eye at its centre, is changed, we will fly into a perfect storm, a hurricane, that will wreak havoc on our national well-being. This is because three things are scheduled to happen all at the same time. Firstly, the National Health Service will finally collapse after workers refuse to subject their bodies to enforced medications. Secondly, our energy bills will skyrocket into the stratosphere as the cap that kept them low is due then to be removed. And finally, our Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, will put up our taxes in his spring budget to pay for the impact on the economy of lockdown Britain. However, Sunak's wife is richer than the Queen, so maybe he could just flog off one of her bracelets on eBay and it would pay off the national debt. Just a thought. But of course it's much more likely that he won't, and then the shivering people will take to the streets. I can't imagine that they wouldn't. It will be like a scene out of Dr. Zhivago. And then that will be the cue for the enemies within, aka also known as the fifth columnists, to jump in just as they did earlier this month when the citizens of Kazakhstan went out to rail against their rocketing fuel bills. You probably know, but this genuine protest was instantly infiltrated by Arab-speaking jihadi fighters who quickly set about lopping off the heads of the policemen. And so matters quickly escalated before the Russians came in to put a stop to it. The springtime is traditionally the beginning of the marching season for the jihadis, the mercenary fighters of the Islamic Caliphate. And so those globalists wanting a so-called colour revolution to effect regime change here will perhaps be hoping to take full advantage of it. One of those may be Tony Blair. He lost a shed load of money over backing the wrong warhorse in that little adventure over in Kazakhstan. Now he's back here and loudly complaining about Boris Johnson having no flat plans for the future of Britain. Well, I'm sure he has plenty of plans for us, most of which we won't like. So one can't help but wonder whether this perfect storm has been cooked up by those of his ilk to effect regime change here. But that would make me a conspiracy theorist, or even worse, an intellectual. It's not widely recognised, but historically speaking, when newly installed communist or fascist regimes demanded the rounding up of the intellectuals, they didn't just mean the Solzhenitsyns and Dostoevskys of this world. They meant anyone who could do joined-up thinking. In Cambodia, during the Pol Pot regime of the 70s, to be considered an intellectual and thus consigned to the killing fields, you only had to be wearing glasses. Anyway, they haven't sent me to the gulag yet, and so I shall press on to explain how there is a way to stop this perfect storm erupting, but it will take wiser and less ideological heads to prevail. Whoever the incumbent of number 10 is on April Fool's Day has to, at least, refuse to remove the cap on energy prices, or even offer to compensate the energy companies. I'm sure Sunak's wife won't mind chipping in. Or he could remove the surcharges on our bills, the ones which go to support renewable energy companies like wind farms and solar panels. They supply no more than 10% of our energy needs here, and so in no way make up for the loss of coal-fired and nuclear power stations, let alone gas pipelines. Yet they account for 25% of our energy bills. Really, to me, this is little more than a ransom, paid to placate a mass psychosis over an emergency that never comes. But even if you're convinced that we are in imminent danger from the sky falling on our heads, you might be surprised to learn that emissions here in Britain only contribute towards 1% of the problem. 40% is created by the three biggest polluters in the world, Russia, China, and India. Yet, they are still building coal power stations in their countries and will not be signing on the dotted line for future restrictions, no matter how much they promise they might. Why? Well, because they haven't lost their minds to wokedom. So our freezing to death will make no difference to the state of the planet. Plus, there will be a £1 trillion size hole in our finances. At the same time, the European Union has to stop fanning around with its outdated ideological hatred of Russia and certify the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that Merkel organised with Putin. This unelected and unaccountable institution, no, I don't mean the Kremlin, I mean Brussels, is people with those still infected by the psychological trauma of the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Many of them would probably be surprised to learn that Russia is no longer a communist country, that its business model is capitalism, and that it regularly holds elections. The European Commission, which in no way owes its right to rule to any democratic procedure, needs to stop trying to teach other countries a lesson over their, air quotes, not being democratic, end air quotes. On top of that, any quaint notions about the Greens being kind and fluffy humanitarians was dispelled in recent months by the spectacle of their party in the German parliament being the most vociferous in demanding war against Russia. Really, the Greens have turned into the neocons, not neocons, but neo-communists, sounding the war drums of the former Soviet Putin-hating oligarchs. As for the NHS collapsing, well, I think it's probably time. This over-bloated drain on our wallets and purses, which seems to have little knowledge about how to effect real healing, hasn't been fit for purpose for decades now, other than as just a front for Big Pharma. On the whole, the only thing its gowned and masked players are fit for is to be characters in an agitprop play about a public health emergency, as they signalled they intended to do in the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympic Games. They don't call it an operating theatre for nothing. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time, I hope. I'm Annie Zilliver, and the name of my Patreon account is Shaman of Avalon, if you'd like to support me.